Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Star Trek One-Liners. This video is a Patreon requested video requested by patron Carrie091. So first thing, before I get into what this top 10 is going to be about, the first thing I want to make very, very crystal clear is that there will be no clips in this video. Those who tune to this video expecting to just see a bunch of clips from the show will be disappointed, because basically a video like that shouldn't exist, because CBS will take it down. CBS is very much against Star Trek clips being shown on YouTube, so that's just not going to happen. I'm sorry, and if that's not what you're in for, if you don't want to hear someone talking about the one-liners of Star Trek, you just want to see a bunch of clips, then I invite you to please leave right now. This video just isn't for you, and that's fine. I mean, there's no reason to complain about it in the comments section. I will pretty much ignore any complaints like that, because I told you right from the start, I warned you, this will not have clips, and if that's not your kind of video, that's fine. You can just go now. Anyway, for those of you who do want me to hear me talk about my favorite Star Trek one-liners, here we go. Let's get into my top 10 best Star Trek one-liners in the entire Star Trek franchise. Now, when Carrie091 first suggested this theme to me, I was trying to think about how I should go about doing this, because when I looked up best Star Trek one-liners online, I got all the very cliche staple ones that everyone knows, like "I've given her all she's got, Captain," and "I'm a doctor, not a bricklayer," and "Make it so," and stuff like that. And I decided I don't really want to talk about those. Everyone knows those ones. Those are the classic, quotes from Star Trek that they've become really cliche and just part of the social consciousness overall, even outside of Star Trek. Instead, I sort of latched on to the term one-liner, because when I hear the term one-liner, I think, personally, Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, such as in Commando, where he killed that guy by shoving a pipe into his chest and steam was blowing out of it, and he said, "Blow off some steam." Or also in Commando, when he said to this guy right before he threw him off a bridge, he was like, "Remember when I told you I'd kill you last? I lied." Or God, my favorite one from Total Recall, when Arnold Schwarzenegger has this it's like a big drilling device, but it looks like a giant screw, and he shoves it in this guy's chest to kill him, and he says, "Screw you!" So I decided to, even though Star Trek doesn't have anything of that particular caliber, the Arnold Schwarzenegger type, I decided to mostly stick to that same sort of theme of the one-liners, rather than classic, "I'm giving her all she's got," or "engaged," and stuff like that. I decided to go to the one-liners that are a bit more witty, sort of more in line with the Schwarzenegger in the sense of, typically, not always, it's said right before they do something badass, right before they arrest someone, or after, or kill someone, or blow up a ship, or something like that, or just a really badass retort that's just really witty and clever. And so that's what I'm going to stick to in this countdown of my favorite top 10 Star Trek one-liners. I'm looking at the entire Star Trek franchise, but mainly focuses on the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise. But I tried to rack my brain to come up with as many as I could, but I'm sure I forgot some really great ones. So if there are some really good ones you can think of that are not on this list, feel free to add them in the comment section. Maybe I might be like, "Oh, damn it, I should have put that on my list," because I feel like there might be a couple I'm forgetting. But anyway, it's funny because after I looked at this list, like I didn't intend it this way, but after I looked at the list, I noted that this list includes a quote from all of the five major captains in the five major shows: original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise. Each captain from each show gets a quote, and I will say I did not intend it that way. I didn't purposely go out of my way. Oh, let me make sure I get an Archer quote in here. It just so happens that every captain, I guess the show writers kind of do it that way. The captain has to get some of the great witty remarks. Anyway, before I get into my top 10 proper, let me start with a few honorable mentions that didn't quite make my top 10 list, but I think should still be mentioned. Anyway, also before I get into this, I will say that a lot of these quotes don't really stand on their own. Some of them are just like, after I read the quote, you might be like, oh, what's the big deal about that? But it's the context of it. It has a great man once said, context is for kings. So, I'll give the context around the quote and why it's so badass or witty or whatever. So anyway, we'll start with my first honorable mention, which is, that is the theme for this evening, isn't it? Kathryn Janeway, Counterpoint. So in this episode, the Voyager's going through a Cavor space or something like that, this alien race that are prejudiced against telepaths, and they arrest and confine all telepaths, and Janeway's hiding a group of telepaths from them, and the main captain of the ship that keeps harassing Voyager comes on board Voyager and says he wants to defect, and says he's going to help Janeway hide the telepaths, and Janeway and him kind of form a little romance, but then eventually, like the Devore ships or whatever they're called, sort of are on to them, and so he suggests going back to his ship in order to throw them off. So he goes back to his ship, and they sort of confine Janeway, and then we find out that he was just pretending all along. He never really wanted to defect. He was just pretending to fall in love with Janeway because he wanted to find the telepaths. And so he's like on to them and about to find all the telepaths, but then he finds out that Janeway prepared for this, and that she actually tricked him and were hiding the telepaths out elsewhere. So he says, when he tries to find this wormhole that the telepaths use to disappear, he says, "Oh, you created false readings." And Janeway replies by saying, "That is the theme for this evening, isn't it? Creating false readings." Then Janeway proceeds to be really badass and says, "Computer, let's actually change the music," because this dude loved playing classical music, so she changed it to something that she liked. And then more and more the guy is finding out just how much Janeway had screwed her and just hid everything and just really pulled the wool over his eyes when he had thought he was the one that had fooled Janeway. It turned out that she had actually fooled him, which I thought was really clever, so I like that one. Next honorable mention I should mention is Assimilate This, Worf First Contact. Now, this one, I feel like I had to mention this one, even though I feel like the writers are kind of trying too hard with this one. This one is probably the most obvious and overt attempt to be like an Arnold Schwarzenegger one-liner, where it's almost a bit too obvious. So I'm not actually that huge of a fan of it, but I feel like I needed to at least mention it. It's okay, I guess. I mean, you guys know the context for this. Worf is on, they just like destroyed this beacon that the Borg were going to use to contact more Borg, and Worf says, Worf says, "Assimilate this," and then he fires the phaser that destroys the beacon. So, yeah, that's all there is to that one. Next honorable mention is, I do not feel pleasure. I'm only an android. Data the most toys. Now, okay, so this one requires a bit of an explanation. The most toys is when Data was kidnapped by Kivos Fajo, a collector, because he wanted a Data as a rare item, and to be in his collection, he faked Data's death and everything. And the whole time, Data was refusing to cooperate with him. Fajo was sort of taunting him and saying, "Oh, you're just an android. You don't feel any emotion. You're just a stupid android." And at the end, Fajo kills his assistant who was trying to help Data escape. And he was like, "Oh, isn't it a shame that you can't feel anger or the rage over her death or the need for revenge? You're just a stupid android." And he thought that Data wouldn't be able to kill him, but Data did try to kill him anyway, proving that he is more than just an android. And then at the end, Fajo is in the brig. He lost his entire... Data informed him, by the way, that he lost his entire collection. He lost everything that he had. And Fajo says, "This must give you great pleasure to see me like this." And Data responds, "I do not feel pleasure. I am only an android." Which is badass. He's just kind of throwing Fajo's reasoning back in his face. I think Data, he doesn't feel emotions. That's true, but I think he does get satisfaction. As we've seen, Data gets satisfaction out of certain things. I think he gets satisfaction after getting the better of Fajo and ruining his life. And that was kind of his Data way of saying, "Aha, fuck you." Anyway, let me get to my last honorable mention, which is, I know they won't get very far. Jean-Luc Picard, Starship Mine. Now, okay, and this is the Die Hard episode of Star Trek, so I kind of had to include it in a one-liner video. But this is basically when Enterprise is evacuated for some Virion sweep bullshit or whatever, but they're terrorists who slip on board who try to steal... well, not really terrorists, they're more mercenaries, but they slip on board the ship to try to steal some valuable stuff from the Enterprise engines or whatever that they can sell on the black market for weapons. And Picard is on the ship and he does this Die Hard thing where he tries to stop them. He slowly kills them off one by one until they get to, it was him versus the lead person, and the lead person gets the better of him and beams away on a tiny little ship. Data contacts them and is like, "Oh, do you know anything about this ship that's going away?" And Picard says, "Well, I know they won't get very far." And he looks down and he has a piece of the the stuff that they were trying to sell in the black market. Apparently it had a little piece that contained it that made it safe, and Picard took it off, so it was no longer safe, so it was going to explode. So he says, "I know they won't get very far," and shortly thereafter the ship that she's on explodes. So that was kind of a badass Picard move anyway. Okay, so now let me get into my top 10 best one-liners of Star Trek. Start with my number 10. That will be the day. Jean-Luc Picard, Yesterday's Enterprise. So, or you could say the alternate Picard, because this takes place in the alternate timeline in Enterprise, where the Federation's at war with the Klingons, and the Klingons are surrounding the Enterprise D, attacking it while the Enterprise C is trying to make its escape through the vortex in order to restore the timeline. And so Picard is doing everything he can to keep the Enterprise C safe, so the Enterprise D is taking all the blunt of the attack. And Picard just saw his ship's about to be destroyed. He saw Riker just got killed, and he takes over, and then the Enterprise, or all the Klingons, hail the Enterprise and surrender your ship and prepare to be boarded. And Jean-Luc Picard, just as a badass he is, he responds by saying, "That will be the day." And he just runs to the tactical station and he just keeps it firing, keeps attacking the Klingons, even though the Enterprise D is doomed. And you see the flames rise up and engulf him as he continues to fight right up to the bitter end. Really, really great, powerful moment. So anyway, number 9 on my top one-liners list is, "And so is your ego." Jadzia Dax, Things Past. Now this one needs a little bit of context. So, Jadzia Dax and Benjamin Sisko and Garrick and Odo are somehow find themselves in this reality where they're in the Bajoran occupation. Everyone else thinks they're Bajorans, and so they find firsthand what it's be like to live under Cardassian rule during the Bajoran occupation. And Dukat sees Jadzia Dax as this Bajoran girl that he wants to try to seduce, because he's an evil fuck. And so Jadzia kind of goes along with it at first and plays being this helpless Bajoran girl, and Dukat's trying to seduce her, and he talks about how he sees the Bajorans as his children and he wants the best for him, and maybe his biggest flaw is he's too nice to them even after they try to kill him. And he says he's going on this stupid diatribe about how he's too nice to the Bajorans, and he says, my heart is too big. And then Jadzia just knocks him out, just hits him and knocks him the fuck out, and says, and so is your ego. Which I loved. I thought that was a really witty remark, so that was great. Anyway, we're getting to my number 8 on my list, which is, but I'm not in Starfleet. Odo, move along home. Now this one I had to add for Carrie091 who requested this video, because this is a quote we often talk about a lot. They'll mention in the comments in my comment sections of my videos all the time, because this is a quote I always quoted a lot from the episode Move Along Home, which most people is generally considered one of the worst episodes of Deep Space Nine, if not the entire Star Trek franchise. And I actually think this episode is okay. Like, I don't think it's great or anything like that, but I don't hate it. I think it's fine. And part of what I often quote about what I like about this episode is this quote in particular, where Odo wants to beam aboard the Wadi ship in order to figure out what happened to Sisko and the other senior officers, and the security chief dude, who's only in 2 episodes, so I don't remember his name, it's not really important, but the Starfleet security guy was like, wait a second, Odo, we can't just go beaming aboard other people's ships. And Odo responds like, oh, is that a Starfleet rule? And he's just like, yeah. And Odo says, but I'm not in Starfleet, which I love. I love the way he says that. I just love that line so much. Now, granted, it doesn't exactly fit my definition of one-liner in this particular case, I guess, because he's not like hitting someone after or before he says it, but I still think it's a badass one-liner, just to be like, screw you. And then he says something like, is it against Starfleet rules to push a few buttons? And just the way Odo's being so defiant is just like, fuck you guys, I do my own thing. I really like that. I just love this line so much. I had to mention it for Carrie091 anyway. We'll get to my number 7, which is, and that is why you're not an evil man. Benjamin Sisko, Waltz. Now, okay, so in Waltz, Sisko's trapped on the planet with Dukat, and Sisko's injured, and he's basically at the mercy of Dukat, who's feeding him and helping him. But Dukat is got a loose screw, and he's trying his hardest to pretend like him and Sisko are best pals and buddies. And Sisko, of course, is at his mercy, so he's going along with this until Dukat beats Sisko quite badly for trying to fix the the beacon so they can escape, and Dukat gives him a really rough beating, and then so Sisko's just done with it, and he's just starting to give Dukat what for and talk about how he was actually an evil man. And Dukat tries to defend himself again, saying that, I actually did all this for the Bajorans, I was kind, and I did this, and eventually Sisko riles them up more and more, where Dukat finally admits that he should have killed them all. And Dukat goes on this crazy rant about, I should have killed all Bajorans everywhere, that is it, that's my mistake, I should have killed them all, I should have wiped them all out. And he goes on this huge rant, and Sisko sneaks up from behind him and knocks him out and says, and that is why you're not an evil man. Which I thought was pretty badass. Alright. So now we'll get into number 6 on my list. Time's Up. Catherine Janeway, Year of Hell. Now again, this is a simple one. You need the context for this one, which I think the context is pretty badass. So Year of Hell is when we have a guy named Anorex who's going around changing the timeline, wiping species out from timeline. And every time he does, it alters the timeline where it's something different. And Janeway and Voyager found shielding to protect against this effect, but they also got the ever-loving crap beat out of them when Voyager was falling apart in pieces. It had to be evacuated. Only like 6 people remained on board, and the whole ship was just a giant trash heap, barely being held together and ready to fall apart. And they came up with a plan to defeat Anorex by destroying his ship, and thus would reset the entire timeline and restore things the way they should be before Anorex started messing around with it. And so Janeway is ready to take Voyager, which she's captaining, and she's ready to ram it into Anorex's ship in order to destroy it. And just before she does, she says, "Time's up," and then boom, crashes Voyager into Anorex, and that restores the timeline. I think that's pretty badass myself. Anyway, we then get into my number 5. I Said You're an Ugly Bastard. Jonathan Archer, Shockwave Part 2. That's funny because usually I don't like Archer's when he tries to be all edgy, especially when he says, "I'm gonna knock you on your ass." I'm like, shut up, Dad. He just sounds goofy. And this is one of the rare cases where I actually think it works. So in Shockwave Part 2, Archer is accidentally brought into the 29th century, and by doing so it completely alters history, where it's a huge trash heap, and Federation never happened, and so he desperately tries to find a way back to the 22nd century so he can restore the timeline. Meanwhile, we got Silik of the Suliban, who is trying to figure out what happened because he can't talk to the future guy who gives his orders from, because obviously the future guy doesn't exist, but he doesn't know that, so he's attempting to talk to the future guy, but Archer is using that as a way to return to the 22nd century. So really, Silik sees this form in the thing of the future guy that he usually talks to, and but it's actually Archer, but he thinks it's future guy, and he's trying to figure out what he's saying. So Archer says something that he can't understand, so Silik starts freaking out and being like, "Please repeat, I didn't understand." And then Archer comes out of the thing, knocks Silik the fuck out, and grabs him and says, "I said you're an ugly bastard." I actually find that it's quite a badass moment, actually. Alright. So next, let's get into my number 4, which is I Know. The Janeway hologram, The Thaw. Again, you need context for this one. So The Thaw is the episode where Voyager encounters this world where there's people who survived a natural disaster by putting themselves in hypersleep. However, they created a virtual environment for themselves while they were in hypersleep, but unfortunately, their fears manifested themselves in a character, the Clown, who then proceeded to hold these people hostage and prevent them from leaving hypersleep, because if they left hypersleep, the Clown would cease to exist, and he sort of became self-aware and wanted to survive and didn't want the people to leave hypersleep. So Janeway comes up with a plan to trick the Clown by getting him to let the others go in exchange for her to come in, but she doesn't actually come in. She sends a hologram of herself in instead, and kind of lets the device read her mind to make the Clown think, to give him the mistaken impression that she is in fact coming in when she's not. And it's funny when Janeway hologram tells the Clown, "Actually, I'm not really Janeway." And he says, "Oh, you could have fooled me." And she replies, "I'm afraid that I did." And I almost put that as the one-liner, because that in itself is a pretty awesome one-liner. The Clown starts freaking out, and Janeway also says, Janeway hologram, I should say, also says, "Starfleet officers don't easily succumb to fear." Get it? Because he's basically the manifestation of all fear. And so then the clown, as he starts to die, lose strength, he says, "I'm afraid." And the Janeway hologram says, "I know." And then he fades to black and dies. That's pretty badass. I gotta say, that was a pretty badass scene. Alright. So next, let's get into my number 3. Sir, there is a multi-legged creature crawling on your shoulder. Spock, a taste of Armageddon. Now, that one is mainly funny, I guess, more than badass. It's kind of silly in a way, I guess. So, the taste of Armageddon, Kirk and Spock are going around the planet trying to wreak havoc and prevent these people from continuing on with this bloody war. And they need to get into these agonizing booths. That's mirror, but whatever they call these things. That actually people are walking in to commit suicide. And Spock and Kirk want to destroy them all. And there's guards protecting them. And so Spock walks up to one of the guards and says, "Sir, there's a multi-legged creature crawling on your shoulder." And the guard just looks at his shoulder, and Spock gives him the Vulcan nerve pinch and knocks him out. Which, that's kind of silly. I guess the guard's reaction would have been more like, "Huh? What the hell are you talking about?" But I just thought that when I saw that moment in like the previews or whatever, I'm like, that's great. That's perfect. Anyway, let me get into my number 2, second best one-liner in all of Star Trek, and that is, "I have had enough of you!" James Kirk, Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. I love this one. I love this one so much. It's very close to making my number 1. It's just perfect. See, this was... First of all, Search for Spock, very underrated movie, and when I talk about why I love it so much, I always mention this line. God damn, I love this line. So basically, Krug, the Klingon, is being ruthless throughout the movie, and he's refusing to listen to reason. He even had Kirk's son killed, and he keeps trying to get the secret of Genesis. And eventually, he and Kirk go mano a mano on the Genesis planet while it's falling apart all around them, and they get to a point where Krug is hanging on an edge of the cliff for his life, and Kirk reaches out his hand to try to save him. He's like, "Give me your hand, let me," because the hero of course has to do that. "Let me save the villain." But Krug is not having it, and instead takes Kirk's leg and tries to throw him off the ledge with him. Like, he'd rather bring Kirk with them and die together than be saved by him. And that is when Kirk has had enough of it, because every time Kirk tries to save this guy's life, he's just an asshole about it. So then he says, "I have had enough of you!" As he's kicking Krug off of the ledge, and after he finishes this one-liner, Krug falls to his fiery death. I'm sorry, but that is badass. Anyway, let me get into my number 1 best one-liner of all Star Trek. And that is, "There are 4 lights!" Jean-Luc Picard, Chain of Command, Part 2. Now again, in this case, Picard is not really doing anything badass like killing someone or arresting someone, but the line itself is the badass punch. That is the biggest way to say F you, the biggest way to punch someone in the gut. So basically, Chain of Command Part 2, Picard's being tortured by this Cardassian who's trying to get information from him. And he keeps asking Picard how many lights he sees when there's 4 lights, but the Cardassian torturer wants Picard to say there are actually 5 lights, and every time Picard refuses to say there's 5 lights, every time Picard says there's 4 lights, the Cardassian dude tortures him, and causes all sorts of pain. So at the end of the episode, the Cardassian dude says, "Okay, here's the end. We don't need information from you anymore, so here's the deal. We got 2 options. First option, you can live this really beautiful, peaceful life. You have women, food, everything you desire. Or you can just be tortured and live in this hell for the rest of your life. And Picard is like, okay, what must I do? And the Cardassian guy says, well, it's quite simple, really. Just tell me how many lights you see. So basically, he wants Picard to say there are 5 lights so he can live this beautiful, peaceful, lovely life. But if Picard refuses and says there's 4 lights, then he gets to live in a hellhole for the rest of his life. And you see Picard sort of freaking out, and later he'll confess to Troy that he actually did see 5 lights at this moment. But then another Cardassian Ghoul comes in and reveals that this guy is full of shit, that Picard is going to be returned to the Enterprise regardless of what he says, that they already made a deal with Starfleet. Which, part of me kind of think ruins this scene a little bit. I kind of wish Picard said there are 4 lights without that context, without knowing that he was safe. But anyway, regardless, that's how it plays out. And so the other Cardassian guy is trying to drag Picard away and said, let's get you cleaned up, let's get you back to the Enterprise. But Jean-Luc refuses to go and turns back to the Cardassian torturer and says, there are 4 lights! And just the way he says it was like the biggest F you to that guy. And I think that was a huge gut punch for him. And it was just such a badass moment. Anyway, those are my top 10 Star Trek one-liners. Thanks for watching so much, even though there were not any clips. Thank you for Carrie091 for suggesting this video. And those who would really enjoy my content and enjoy my channel, I would humbly recommend that you support me on Patreon. It's, for one thing, very helpful for me to keep this channel going. And I do want to thank all those Patreon supporters who do support me on Patreon. It's a lot of help. You get some perks, you get some Patreon only videos. I just finished doing a series of Star Trek the Animated Series where I reviewed every episode of Star Trek the Animated Series, and I'm just about to start another series where I'll take reviews, I'll do polls for what Star Trek episode I want to review just for Patreon supporters, and I will release those videos just for Patreon supporters, at least for the first couple of months. I'll release it to the public later on, but Patreon supporters will get to see that first. And then also Patreon supporters will get a list of my schedule so they know what all the videos coming up in the coming months. And in addition, I pre-release certain Star Trek videos, such as my Star Trek Next Generation season reviews. I release them a couple weeks in advance for my Patreon supporters. And if you donate $10 or more, you can request for me to do videos just like this one, and I'll do it. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.